Okay,
We're
hello
good.
everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of a technical difficulty. This is my very first time ever doing a live stream, so please bear with me. I do have a PhD, so presumably I'm going to be able to figure out StreamYard at the very least. Yeah, so thank you all so much for being here. I'm Zach Hancock. I am an evolutionary biologist. I specialize in population genetics. And on this channel, you've seen a mix of evolution education, a little bit of pseudoscience debunking, and some history and philosophy of science. And today, we're doing a very special stream to celebrate February 12th, which, if you didn't know, is the birth date of Darwin, aka this is Darwin Day. Darwin was born on this day in 1809. The very first Darwin Day celebration started shortly after his death. They were actually hosted by his family at Down House. It was just like a group of family and friends would get together and celebrate him and his life. And then in 1909, at the 50th year anniversary of the publication of Origin of Species, it became like a bunch of scientists all around the world got together and did a big celebration, and they called it Darwin Day. And basically, ever since then, it has been a celebration all around the world. And so, yeah, so it's marked both by celebrating the man, but also just evolutionary biology writ large. So before we get started here today, I want to introduce my panel of guests. I'll have them introduce themselves, tell a little bit about your channel, what you do, and we'll start with Dr. Dan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Dan. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I teach full-time. I teach intro bio and evolutionary bio to undergraduates. I currently have like almost 900 of them this semester, which is keeping me on my toes. And what I do on my channel, which is called Creation Myths, is I look at the claims of scientific creationism and tell you why they're wrong. So we're looking at things like genetic entropy, or irreducible complexity, the waiting time problem, anything in that, in that general kind of, in that general range. Mostly I focus on kind of the genetic stuff because that is my background. I don't get into too much like the geology or the cosmology or even like the kind of paleoanthropology stuff. Not my expertise, not the thing I do. But my goal is really to provide a resource for people who are non-scientists, who are not geneticists or biologists or whatever, and provide resources that they can understand that you can then take and use when you encounter science-y sounding creationist claims that use all the buzzwords but don't actually make sense when you dig beneath the surface. So that's what I do, and the channel is Creation Myths. And if you know Zach, you definitely know me. So.
And then my name is Grayson Hawk. My YouTube channel is eponymously named Grayson Hawk. I kind of like a jack of lots of trades and a master of none. I'm the only non-biologist on the panel tonight, so I'm mostly going to be here for moral support while, to help the two biologists through the butchering of Darwin and evolution that we're probably going to be subjected to here. But on my channel, I do go into the genetics, the cosmology, the geology, like pretty much all of the different fields of science, and super into history too, mainly against pseudoscientists pushing out false information to the public in those various areas. So I argue with the young earth creationists and the flat earthers and all the various pseudoscientists because I really love science and I hate when people spread mistruths about it. So yeah, that's probably what we're going to be in here for tonight. And I still love talking science, don't get me wrong. And I'm very much excited to be talking to the rest of the panel about said science tonight.
Yeah, so I thought, what better way to celebrate Darwin than to review all the ways in which creationists lie about him? I feel like very often what we do is whenever we see Darwin like sort of quote mined or taken out of context or just like sometimes downright lied about, we just like brush it aside and we say, it doesn't actually matter what Darwin thought or believed. Like, we're talking about science. Darwin is not a prophet. Even if he did say those things, they're wrong and it doesn't matter now, right? We've had 150 years of biology ever since. But since it is Darwin Day, I thought we would actually take the chance and defend the man for once and talk a little bit about what Darwin actually believed and what he actually thought. And the way that we're going to do that is we can just kind of go around, talk about some of the myths that we've heard creationists spread about Darwin. But I also have a video here. This is a talk that was given by the Dr. John Sanford, a retired Cornell plant geneticist, inventor of the gene gun, big brain creationist. And his talk is titled "Darwin Was Wrong," and he gives us all of the really big creation myths, basically, within this. Oh, and I said the name. I said creation myths. It gives us all of the big creation myths within this video.
Branding.
So, yeah.
Branding.
Yeah, branding. Okay, so before we jump into this video, did either of you have anything you want to share that the viewers should know about Darwin? Any prepared facts, anything you're excited to share, to talk about, or just like what's the biggest myth that we just need to debunk before we even start watching this video?
Why don't you go first, Grayson?
Okay, yeah. So I 100% love when Zach first proposed the idea for this stream. I loved it because, and that was a perfect setup. Every time, or almost every time, I get into an argument or discussion with evolution, about evolution with a creationist, I hear, "Oh, did you know? But Darwin was a racist," or "Oh, Darwin actually stole evolution from some other guy," or Darwin actually was not a good scientist at all, and he was really lazy, and he was actually probably I've literally heard him described as a quote depressed loser to me before, and they're like the character assassination that goes on for Darwin as a person, not even about his ideas or about anything that he proposed, but about trying to specifically tear down him as a person. The lie that I would like to bring up that I often hear is the abuse of a certain quotation from Darwin's father, where Darwin's dad really wanted him to be a medical doctor. He sent him to medical school. And then Darwin, here's a fun fact, really, really squeamish about the sight of blood. Darwin could not stand seeing blood. And so he had barely any interest in the medical classes. He liked his geology course or the science exams. And he was really loved collecting beetles. Dude was obsessed with beetles.
Love beetles.
But because he didn't want to be a doctor and because he wasn't interested in his medical studies, his father basically said, you're going to be a disgrace to this family. All you care about is, messing around, hunting and shooting and whatever the exact quote is. And the creationists will love to say, latch onto this quote from again. When Darwin was very young, before he'd even established his career as a naturalist, and they latch onto this quote as saying, look, even Charles Darwin's dad knew that he was good for nothing and that he was such a loser. And I'm oh my goodness, using a quote from your dad when you were in your early 20s or late teens to try to assassinate your character over an entire career as a man who lived into his 70s. It's crazy.
Is there anyone whose parents wouldn't say the same thing about them when they were a teenager?
Right,
I can guarantee you my parents would have said the same thing about me as a teenager.
There was a family gathering at some point when I was still in grad school, and my younger cousin, who was in high school at the time, asked me, was "You're still in school? What grade are you in?" I was like, "I am in 23rd grade right now." Sorry, I've just been in school forever. I'm never leaving, apparently. And to judge somebody based on the parent's satisfaction at that age, folks, what are we doing here? We're character assassinating Darwin. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, we are. That is exactly what we're doing. Yeah. One of my favorite, because you brought this up about him being really into collecting beetles, and this is from his autobiography, and I think one of my favorite stories is he's got 2 beetles that he's holding.
That was my fun fact. I thought that you wouldn't know that I was.
Come on, of course he knows it.
You think I haven't read Darwin's autobiography?
Come on.
I don't know who I thought I was dealing with. I told Zach that I was
Grayson,
going to try to
You
find
have
a
to
fun
step your
quote.
game up.
I told Zach that there was going to be a fun quote. I was going to try to find that he didn't already know about Darwin, and it looks like that's not going to happen.
Have you all have both of you and chat? Have you all seen the video when James Franco goes on Stephen Colbert's show and tries to out nerd him in terms of Tolkien mythology,
the Lord of the Rings? Yeah.
And he and Colbert's response is, "How dare you? You come into my house." That's what just happened here.
Yep.
I have a Darwin ornament right here behind me, my man.
Tell the story, Zach. You're going to do a better job of it than I would of telling the story anyway.
So Darwin loved collecting beetles, right? That was what he was really, really excited about when he was young. And he had these 2 beetles that were super rare, and he just could not let them go. And there was a 3rd beetle that he saw. And he's like, oh my gosh, I have to also catch this beetle. So what he did is he popped one of the beetles he was holding into his mouth so that he could then reach and grab the other beetle. But the beetle that he popped into his mouth, like, released this like vile toxin into his mouth. And it was just so terrible that he was like, blah, and he had to spit it out, and he ended up losing all the beetles because it was like so gross. So yeah, this is
wait, Zach. Here's a question though. Do you know the name of Charles Darwin's beetle catching rival at Cambridge? Because when Darwin was at Cambridge, he was again super into catching beetles. And there was one other guy at Cambridge who was also super into beetles, and he and that other guy had a competition to see who could find the first new species of beetle.
I do not remember his name. I do remember the story, but I do not remember his name.
I remember his. Okay, I'll get the exact full name, but I do remember that when they were describing his name, it was Charles quote Beetle Bagginsby or whatever his name, like last name was, where like his nickname was literally Beetle. So like you can't beat a guy like that at finding beetles.
Yeah.
But,
So Darwin was really into collecting beetles. He was a big naturalist. So we got a fun fact from Grayson. Dr. Dan, do you have a fun fact you'd like to share before we hear some untrue things from Sanford?
No. Strictly speaking, no, I do not have a fun fact. I have an unfun fact. And my unfun fact is this, that here we are on Darwin Day in the year of our Lord, 2025. And we're going to have fun with, John F. and Sanford over here. And like, it's all fun and games. But also let us remember, given the state of the world right now, that the Creationist Project and the Young Earth Creationist Project is part of the broader Christian nationalist political project, and it's all of a piece. Not an hour ago on my channel, I aired a video about Discovery Institute, and they're part of this mess too. It's all about imposing a Christian nationalist theocracy on the United States in place of a secular constitutional order where everybody has the same rights independent of whoever you are, right? That's like, we can make fun of this, and making fun of fascists is important, and you should laugh at fascists because screw them and they're silly. But also, this is serious business we're dealing with here. And I just want everybody to remember kind of the context in which we are celebrating Darwin in 2025. And secondly, important point related to something that Zach said at the top, how in every creationist video or article or whatever, there's always that like, and Charles Darwin, blah, 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 blah. And then the people responding to that, the people refuting that, always say, like, either they ignore that part or they say, like, yeah, it doesn't matter. We've moved on since Darwin. Let's talk about the modern theory. And that is a great illustration of how the BS asymmetry principle is such an insidious force. Because if the thing that we always put aside are the lies and the slander and the character assassination about Darwin, then that stuff just goes out there. And the conception that people have of Charles Darwin is all of these bad things that never get refuted because there's always 9 more things to refute that are more important substantively than the stuff about Darwin's biography, right? So this is, I guarantee you we're going to laugh at the stupid things that John Sanford says and other creationists say about Charles Darwin. But also, like, this is a serious thing. It's part of kind of the various strategies that creationists employ to make it hard to deal with the stuff that they say. And I want everybody watching this, we can all enjoy this, but let's keep all that stuff in mind.
Yeah.
And before we start, I have one very serious thing to add on top of all that. I looked it up just to make sure, and his name was Charles Beatles Babington.
Babington.
Yep, Beatles Babington.
That's
Beatles
a hobbit.
Babington.
That's not a real person. That's a hobbit.
That's a hobbit.
Well, he was Charles Darwin's greatest beetle rival.
All right. Let's see what John Sanford has to say about Darwin. Whenever someone wants to jump in and stop, just let me know. And he's gonna lay out for us. I've skipped a little bit ahead. Also, he's kind of a sleepy character that speaks really slow. I'm very sorry if his voice puts you to sleep.
If we could, I guess we already have the slide up. First slide up. Darwin was wrong. I just want to say that the right person at the right time. But I think he was quite an ordinary man based upon what I've read about him. And yet, even though he seems like a pretty normal person, he was exalted as if he was royalty. In fact, when he died, he was the royal
stop
family
right there.
of England.
He was exalted like royalty.
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing? What are we even doing?
Yeah. So about 10 seconds that I skipped before this, he said, "Is Darwin the greatest scientist ever?" Some people think so.
Yes, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
I just like right now, all this is coming across as is like Sanford being a huge hater that people like Darwin and he was popular. It's like, he strikes me as such an ordinary, normal guy, not worthy of this great praise. It's like, okay, well, maybe people were not praising him for like what an amazing, perfect, flawless individual human he was, and maybe they were praising him for his accomplishments and his ideas that were like incredibly revolutionary and deserving of praise.
Yeah.
Came to his funeral, and he was buried in Westminster's Abbey, which is remarkable given that he was an atheist. And so
Okay, wait.
there's something special that empowered.
Okay, yeah. First of all, I know that obviously we're going to talk about how Darwin definitely was not an atheist, but I'm a little bit like distracted by like Westminster's Abbey. Like, who is Westminster? Like, who's that? Like, this is a small point, but
He's very sleepy. This is the thing about Sanford. He's very sleepy, so sometimes he just like runs words together.
Yeah.
But I mean, everybody, I think that is one of the most common lies about Darwin is that he's an atheist. But,
Famously not an atheist. That's why it took 20 some odd years to publish Origin of Species.
Yeah.
Inflicted.
Darwin, and indeed, we can safely say that he changed the world. He was quite clearly the greatest atheist maker in history. And if we think about the multiple generations that have passed since his time, we can arguably say that he destroyed over 1 billion souls. So,
all right, pause. No, pause. I'm sorry. What you folks have to understand about John Sanford, I'm sorry. You got to understand about John Sanford is somewhat unique among young Earth creationists, is that his kind of conversion to the faith was fairly late in life. Like Zach gave his intro about Cornell and the gene gun and everything. He converted after all that stuff. And then he became, there's no faith like the faith of a convert, right? And so he really dove all in. And since his conversion, he has been really... militant is not an exaggeration here. So, for example, currently him, and you could see his colleague on this presentation is Chris Roop, who may or may not be Dr. Chris Roop at this point. He's working on it. Last I spoke with him, but that was a couple of years ago. I don't know. And they have this thing called the FMS Foundation.
Feed my sheep.
If you go to their website, most of it is about, and I'm quoting this phrase directly from their website, quote, the sexual Holocaust.
Yeah.
All right. It's 100% culture war LGBT stuff. It's really bad, really super gross stuff. And like, you got to understand, you can't understand John Sanford unless you have read all the stuff on that website, because he's like famous for genetic entropy, and Zach has done I think the definitive review of Sanford's book, The Genetic Entropy, The Mystery of the Genome, and all the nonsense in there. But you cannot understand where Sanford is coming from unless you peruse the FMS website and you go, oh, this is like a right-wing evangelical talk show host embodied in a person. Like, you cannot, I know talk show hosts are people, but you know what I mean. Like, that's what he's coming from here. So when he's talking about Darwin as like the person who has cost the most souls, it's like how I talk about Edward Jenner historically as the person who has saved the most lives, because that's the person who invented modern vaccines, right?
Yeah.
It's in the same vein as that. And we just have to understand that background in order to understand why he's presenting this the way it is, which is not normally how people talk about Charles Darwin. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is such a dumb analysis from Sanford to have of like, well, Darwin put forward the theory of evolution, and then like people that thought that evolution was true, some of them did eugenics, or like, some of them used his ideas to do other stuff. And it's like, if you're going to attribute those deaths directly to Darwin, then that would mean that like the greatest mass murderer in human history would be like the inventor of the wheel or something, because like think of all the people that have been killed.
It's like attributing like all of the deaths for like at Nagasaki and Hiroshima to Albert Einstein, right? It's like can we trace how far can one
Mary Curie, right? Like, you have to go how many steps back, right?
Yeah, Mary Curie, by discovering radiation, is directly responsible for how many deaths. I mean, it's that's the same level of analysis here.
Yeah. All right, Sanford.
About what he did and what he taught. So let's move on with the slides. There are 4 books that if you really want to know about Darwin, I would recommend. The first one is obvious, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. That's a long, long title, isn't it? And so that's the famous book. It's been, usually people shorten it to Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And you'll notice that I put a line under by means of natural selection, because now the nature of natural selection is being questioned. And so that's going to be a point of contention, I think. So the second book, the first book, by the way, very thick, very slow, very methodical.
Like Sanford.
I guess that was during that era. People liked really fat books. And so that is a very useful book to understand what he was teaching. But it is
so I'm gonna actually agree with Sanford here. I think everyone, except for the part that I don't actually think it's a hard read. For a book written in the 1850s in Victorian England, it's actually pretty readable. It's even more readable than most of Darwin's other books.
I mean, I read it for the first time like when I was in middle school, and it's not like it was like, I was comprehensible. Like, I didn't get every single thing in middle school, but I was like able to get the gist of what he was saying, like, and when he says it's a very thick book, like it's not that long of a book. Like, what does he mean by that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like not much bigger than a normal novel length. Like if you read novels, you can read Origin of Speed. Like it's not like it's 1,000 pages. For depending on the print size, it's only 300 to 400 pages. So it's a very readable size. It's a very readable book. I would recommend everybody, if you have not read it, I would recommend you read it. I think he makes an incredibly persuasive argument. Even today, it's a very persuasive argument. I also often recommend you read the first edition. In later editions, he started to soften a little bit on his stance of natural selection. He started adding in a little bit of like use and disuse ideas. So I'm convinced that his first edition was the most correct. He got most right in the original edition.
I will just say he did throw in that little bit. I forget what chapter it's in, but in one of the later editions, he threw in that little paragraph that basically described punctuated equilibrium, which everyone's like, 1970s, right? Like, Gould and Eldridge, right?
Yeah.
Darwin called it in 68, maybe. I forget the year of the edition where he added that paragraph, but he did describe punctuated equilibrium without using the words in one of the later editions.
He also is able to add in more fossils in some of the later editions. Like he adds in Archaeopteryx in a later edition. He also takes out some things. So like he was having lots of correspondences with people, right, going on at this time. And the biggest contention was around the mechanism of inheritance. And so some of the examples that he used in the first edition, that now that we know how Mendelian inheritance works, are good examples. He was worried that they wouldn't work under blending inheritance. And some people pointed out that to him in letters. And so he removed them. So it's things that it was a living document that he was working on. But point being, you should definitely read it. It's a very readable.
You should read it. And if you suffer from insomnia, highly recommended, not because it's poorly written, but because it's beautifully written, is Voyage of the Beagle.
That's true. It's very poetic. You will be surprised actually how poetic Darwin is in it.
Now,
he's a great writer.
Here's the question for all the real Darwin heads out there, right?
I'll just stop you right there. I have not read the Barnacles book.
I was not going to say the Barnacles book because that's actually 4 volumes. I was going to say his very last book that he ever wrote in his life is not included in this list. And it's all about earthworms, which was his later in life obsession. And it's about, like, he actually did some really pioneering work, again, illustrating that he's not some ordinary normal guy. Like, he did some really good work on, like, showing that earthworms were, like, responsible for, like, increasing the quality of the soil, and had this interaction with creating soil environments that, like, was not very well known about that or researched back then. So, like, he did lots of stuff in other fields. Dan talked about his barnacle thing. Like, even before he was introducing any of these ideas about evolution, like, he was like seen as an expert naturalist for his work on barnacles. Like, it was seen as like the work about barnacles. So he was already, like, seen as a talented scientist way before he even published anything about evolution. But yeah, the Earthworm book, if you are actually looking for something to fall asleep to, maybe the Earthworm book might be something to check out.
Yeah, I mean, he worked on earthworms. He was also the first person to demonstrate that plants can move. He worked with the climbing plants and that they would move towards sunlight, which was really amazing.
Darwin, this is a famous thing that I am talking about in class next week, is that it's Darwin and Darwin. It was Charles Darwin and his son discovered plant hormones. If he had never done evolution, plant biologists would still be like, Charles Darwin is one of the most important people ever, because he discovered I shouldn't say discovered is not the right word. He showed that there was a chemical signal that governs plant growth, which turned out to be auxins.
Yeah, he also provided the first ever theory of the formation of coral atolls. So, like, these things that you see out in like islands when you have volcanoes that basically depress, and then you're just left with the rings. Like, he's the one that explained how that happened.
So cool.
Oh, and wait, last one, Zach. As a marine invertebrate guy, like, I mean, his Darwin's like earliest work, like I think his very first scientific publication was about how the little black spots on some marine shells are actually like the larvae of really tiny marine invertebrates.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that was his like first scientific paper when he was supposed to be taking classes at med school.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Zach, before we go any further,
Uh-huh.
private chat, wrench me in the real chat.
Wait, do I know how to do that?
Just hit the 3 dots and say make a moderator or whatever, because we have to ban a transphobe from the chat.
Can I do it? Can you tell me how to do
You
it?
can do it.
Which one is it?
let the door hit you on the way out.
It's I think it's Mountain Mover. Hang on, don't do anybody until I find him. Hang on. No, wait, hang on. No, it was Nicholas Williams. It was the LG. Yeah, it was Nicholas Williams. Sorry, Mountain Mover. I didn't mean to smirch your good name.
Didn't mean to besmirch your good name.
Yeah, no, it was Nicholas Williams. Ban that guy.
All right,
I'm assuming
all right.
guy.
All right, get the fuck out of here.
There you go.
All
Transphobes
right.
not
They are
welcome.
removed.
Thank you.
Transphobes are not welcome. All right,
Right.
back to Darwin.
Hard to finish that type of a book. The second book is The Descent of Man, and that came quite a bit later in his life. And he was very worried about how people might react when he wrote the book that said that man evolved from apes. And so, of course, in a Victorian era, when a lot of people in England were still Christians, this was very controversial. And so I don't recommend it because it was incredibly poorly written, very scattered, and most of it is not actually about the descent of man, but is on other topics that are tangential.
I will say The Descent of Man is a hard read.
Jealous.
It is. I think it's actually quite a bit longer, and he touches on a lot of topics in The Descent of Man. But he does introduce the idea of like sexual selection. It's like Descent of Man, where he finally solves the peacock problem that haunted him for so many years. And it was The Descent of Man actually where him and Alfred Russel Wallace have their big break, because Darwin believed that the reason that like sexual selection was happening was just because of sort of like aesthetic choice in females. It wasn't that females were picking the best males in any kind of like survival sense. It was just that the females were choosing what they thought was beautiful. And since males had more, would then have more offspring, that was what was driving it. Whereas Alfred Russel Wallace believed, no, there must be some survival reason that they're doing it. And so actually there was this sort of a break between Darwin and Wallace over the idea of sexual selection and whether or not sexual selection was based on like aesthetic choice, like Darwin thought. And there is like The Descent of Man is also where you do get the racism and misogyny that is in Darwin's belief system. Like we're not going to sugarcoat the truth here. Like Darwin was a misogynist and he was a racist. He was a Victorian man living in the 1870 England.
He was a rich white dude in mid 1800s England. Yeah. Like that dude was racist and sexist as hell.
Yeah. And so like this is where if you're going to see quotes from Darwin that are misogynistic and racist, they are going to come from Descent of Man, because that's when he is dealing with this sort of with the evolution of man. So yeah, if you want a little bit of a deeper dive into Darwin's thoughts, you can read it. It is a bit of a tougher read though.
So you might not necessarily need to read that book. The book, The Autobiography of Charles Darwin, is very interesting and actually short. And it really makes it very clear that he was definitely a hardcore atheist. And so it's very interesting reading because of.
It doesn't say that at all.
What are we supposed to say to that?
It was, when he said this is when I was convinced that Sanford has not read any of these books.
I'm not sure where Darwin, if this is in his autobiography, probably not, but like Darwin makes arguments for the necessity of some sort of deistic creator for the universe or whatever. Like he's arguing, like he makes arguments that are about like, oh, design and like, oh, there's just how could the universe have begun without a creator? And like he makes those arguments. I don't know what Sanford is reading.
I think Darwin is just like every other person that is going through like their life and they don't know what they believe. And so like he does this. So at parts in his life, he leans more sort of deistic. At other parts in his life, he's more agnostic. And I think there was a letter late in his life that I think sums it up best, and where he like straightforwardly says that at no point in my life have I ever been an atheist. He said, you know, that I have walked back and forth between deism and sort of agnosticism, depending on the weather, right? But at the end of the day, I have never been an atheist. And that's like at the end of his life, he writes this letter to a friend. And it's to a friend, so you know he's being candid, right? It's not like this is a publicly facing thing. The original published autobiography was curated by his children because it was not written to be for public. It was written for his children and his wife, actually, and friends. And so they took out some of the things that they thought were too personal for the general public. That was actually added back in by his grandchildren, I believe. And so now you can actually read the full thing.
You get the director's cut, yeah.
Yeah, the director's cut has now been published, and most of the stuff that they removed was actually him talking about religion, because he was being very sort of open about his sort of religious beliefs, and he presented a sort of agnostic viewpoint of the world, and he struggled with the idea that there could be an all-loving God in sort of a personal sense, because of death and war and famine and all the bad things in the world, right? And also you should read the autobiography. It is very short. It's very readable. It's kind of funny. It was written again for his children and wife. So it's, it's very personable.
I think that is where the story of the three Beatles comes from.
It is. Yeah, it is.
He was a very interesting man. And then lastly, the fourth book is Darwin, The Life of a Tormented Evolutionist. So that probably seems pretty strange, don't you think? And yet this book was considered by Stephen Jay Gould one of the top evolutionary scientists of the last century. He said this about the book. He said, unquestionably the finest biography ever written about Darwin. Goes on to say Desmond and Moore, who are the biographers, are brilliant. So it's really an interesting thing. It does appear, as I've read that book, that Darwin was not just unhappy, but often felt tormented. So that's something we might talk about later in the.
Yeah, I mean, he felt tormented because he knew the repercussions of like bucking a society that was going to like be vehemently against him, right? It's like he had a wife that was very religious. He had been brought up in a religious household. He was in a society in which religion dominated everything. And he was a person that didn't like confrontation. He didn't like to fight. He didn't like to be in the public eye. And so he knew that doing this, that putting this idea out there was going to cause problems. And he was afraid of that, right? And so like, yes, he was tormented, but he was tormented because he was torn between not wanting to rock the boat and being a scientist and believing that he had to tell the truth because he thought he had the correct answer. All the evidence pointed to it, and it would be irresponsible for him to not go ahead and put that idea out there.
He joined the clergy initially. Like, that was because when you were like a rich white dude in England at the time that Darwin was a rich young white dude, you had three options basically. You could be a doctor, and as we talked about, Darwin was icked out by blood, so that wasn't an option. You can go into the military, or you can join the clergy. Those were like options 1, 2, 3, right? And he didn't want to join the military, so he went into the clergy, and he was bored, and that's how he ended up on the Beagle. Like, it wasn't that he didn't buy into it. It's not that he wasn't like devout or whatever. It's just like intellectually he was not satisfied with it, so he left the clerk. Like he left. I don't know if he was had finished seminary school. I forget what the ages are of the whole thing, but like that was originally his career path, and then he did kind of a Gregor Mendel, but he left instead of staying. And the other kind of side of this is, he did The Voyage of the Beagle was the first half of the 1830s, and then Origin of Species was published in 1859. And the main reason it was published when it was is because Alfred Russel Wallace burst onto the scene like the Kool-Aid man, and he was going to publish his ideas that were the same. And Darwin was like, I'm not going to get scooped by this whippersnapper over here. I've been writing about this stuff for, the better part of 20 years. And he had this manuscript more or less ready to go when Wallace started exchanging letters with him in the 1850s. And one of the reasons he had withheld it for that long was he recognized the implications and was hesitant to kind of start that kind of controversy. He didn't want to be involved in that controversy. And to paint this guy as like some kind of militant atheist is just silly when we know that the reason it was published in 1859 instead of 1849 or 1839 was because he knew there was going to be a controversy about it that would have potentially theological implications, and didn't want to have that conversation at all. If he was actually the militant atheist Sanford wants to present him as, he would have just thrown that book out there, in the late 1830s and started recruiting for his atheist hordes that could deconvert everybody.
And people did, right? There were books on evolution long before Darwin. The idea was everywhere in the Western world at this point in time. Like Robert Chambers had published Vestiges on the natural history of creation just a few years prior. No one was afraid to talk about evolution. Everybody that did became in the public eye and it became controversial, but Darwin didn't want that. He didn't want to be this controversial pariah. And so he was like, I have to get everything right. I have to collect as much data as possible. I have to talk to everyone and look at every single thing before I put it together. And when Wallace sent his paper, he was like, I'm scooped. I'm done. I'm finished. But his friends came together and they're like, no, dude, you got this first. You need to put this out there. Give us your abstract. We will go to the Royal Society and we will read your paper. Don't give up. You've been doing this for a long time. And they convinced him to go ahead and put out his abstract. And it should be pointed out that a thing that actually Sanford is not going to say it in this particular video, but creationists will often lie and say that Darwin stole the idea from Wallace. This is absolutely false. Wallace, to his dying day, called it Darwinism. He believed that this was Darwin's idea. He wrote a book called Darwinism, right? Where he laid out Darwin's theory, and he called it Darwin's theory.
I think he also regularly referred to himself as the moon to Darwin's sun. I mean, he knew the story. The creationists are the ones that try to flip it and give him all this credit.
I mean, the famous, I think, tree from Darwin's notebooks was from 1837, and Alfred Russell Wallace was a decade younger than Darwin. So I forget when Wallace was born, but when Darwin made that little sketch in his notebook, it was I think, as though it's nothing, but it turned out to be I think, no big deal, just the most important concept in the history of the field of biology. Darwin Wallace was a child, literally a child, when Darwin wrote that. It's just silly.
But one of the things I think that's really interesting about Wallace and coming up with very similar ideas as well, other than the historical what ifs and stuff, are the fact that in terms of specifically natural selection, right? Because this whole idea of species changing and the transmutability of species that had been discussed for a while, even by Charles Darwin's grandfather and stuff. But the idea of natural selection, being the agent of this, that was Darwin's. That was a fairly unique contribution to Darwin. And this Wallace guy also kind of had similar ideas of that along with that, and they were both inspired by Malthus's book on populations, and like they both read that book, and both were like reading what Malthus was writing about how populations change over time, and both of them came to the realization of like, wait a minute, this might have some like relevance for biological species here.
Yeah, it was the perfect confluence of like Malthus coming out with his population growth ideas, and then you just needed like some natural historians to go sail around the world and look at some populations that had just happened to have also read Malthus, right?
Right.
And like those two things come together, and suddenly like
that happened twice in the span of 2 decades.
Yeah.
And one last thing, just in terms of the lies that are told about Charles Darwin's religion. We talked about the lie of Charles Darwin being an atheist, but there's also another lie, an opposite lie that I often encounter. That's the deathbed conversion thing where they say, oh, don't you know that on his deathbed, Charles Darwin converted to Christianity, and thus like implying that he like had some last minute change of heart or something and abandoned evolution on his deathbed. And it's like, if you try to look into that, it like that originates from like this like woman that it's not even clear if she ever knew or met Charles Darwin, and it's just like an actually fabricated lie.
Yeah, his children actually debunk that like in their lifetimes, right? Like they said this woman was never near their father, So I'm always stunned anytime that comes up. I'm like, guys, like I thought even creationists abandoned this one a long time ago.
I will say I just right now popped onto both Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International. Both of them have pages on AIG. It's called Arguments to Avoid, and on CMI, it's Arguments We Think Creationists Should Not Use. And both of them have the Darwin deathbed conversion on the list.
Okay.
Which is
progress.
Broken clock.
Yeah.
All right, back to Sanford.
Question and answer period. So those are the books that are especially significant in my mind. And so I'm going to give you a quick overview, and we're going to talk about the 7 ways.
So what we might do, since we're like 46 minutes in, is we will let him give the top things, and we'll just talk about the top things.
And we'll just go through the
watching
7,
the whole thing.
We don't need to watch the rest. We got the 7, and we can just
look at the list and we'll just go through them.
Yeah.
That Darwin was wrong. Okay, so number 1, obviously he was wrong about God. Number 2, I'm going to show that he was wrong generally about science. Number 3, he was generally wrong about geology.
I think science covers that one.
Number 4, he was generally wrong about the fossil record. Number 5, he was wrong about the tree of life. Number 6, he was wrong about the nature of life. And number 7, he was wrong about natural selection. So
it's quite unfortunate that he doesn't give a little bit more detail in this overview about what each of these things are supposed to be. Yeah.
I'm very confused.
Yeah. So I will say the God one is I think he gives some quotes about like God, about the God doing evil thing, like God being evil because there is famine and bad stuff in the world. Like I think he talks about that a little bit. My plan was to skip the God part and just go to the science stuff anyways, because this is when he claims that Darwin is just a philosopher. He's not he's not really a scientist. He's an armchair philosopher. So that's what he was talking about in the second one.
That's wrong.
Yeah, how many armchair philosophers were conducting expansive experiments in their backyard on earthworms in their free time? This man was such a scientist that even when he's retired, when he's old, when he's had an accomplished career, he can do anything he wants. He's retired. He decides to devote years of his life to studying earthworms. Like, that is a true scientist. That's not a philosopher.
Yeah, he this is one of the, when this video came out, all the comments have been turned off for this video.
Yeah,
but
they do that. This channel does that. It's very frustrating.
I watched this live when it was being aired, and I was so furious when he got to this part. And he was like, Darwin was just an armchair philosopher that did no experiments. I was like, are you kidding me? Because just that summer, I had gone to the Evolution Conference, and the keynote speaker that year was James Costa. And Costa is kind of like a popular science writer, and he wrote a book called Darwin's Backyard. And it's basically a book that can walk you through how to do all of Darwin's experiments. And it was like specifically designed to like teach in like undergrad so that you can have them basically do it. And it's a whole book of all of the different experiments that Darwin did. And I was just like, I can't believe this. So yeah, so Darwin did a ton of different experiments. He bred pigeons was one of his biggest thing, right? Is that he bred tons and tons and tons of fancy pigeons. He was actually extremely close to figuring out Mendelian genetics before Mendel did. He was so close.
So close.
Because he was crossing both pigeons as well as like a bunch of different kinds of flowers and plants, etc. And he found, he writes that in the first generation, it's uniformity. But then when with following mixes, all of the forms reappear. So like, but he didn't put like the numbers to it. He didn't have the stats brain to put it together. But he saw Mendelian genetics right there. He was so close to figuring it out. And he did that because he was interested in heredity, right? He was interested in where variation comes from, what kind of variation can you produce. So he was doing lots of breeding experiments, lots of crossing experiments. He also was really into ecology. Like he did some of the early like food web style stuff. So he had all of these experiments in his backyard where he would like clear out the field, like just dig up everything that was there, put fresh dirt, fence it off. And then he would sprinkle seeds from all kinds of different plants into it. And then he would let them grow, and he would record which ones competed and which ones won out across replicate plots, right? And so he was able to document the competitive ability of different plants depending on who their neighbors were, right? And this is like, we do this today. They're called exclusion experiments, right? And so like, that style of experimentation is still done in ecology to this day. We've already talked about like the climbing plants, the earthworms. Darwin did a ton of experiments. It's pretty baffling to me that he could say this. So the next one is like he's wrong about geology. This is he talks about Lyell's uniformitarian thing. He basically claims that that Darwin believed in uniformitarianism. He gives the example of when on the voyage of the Beagle, when Darwin and Fitzroy, etc., are sailing up the Santa Cruz in Argentina, and Darwin is like writing down, because like if you've ever like looked at Google Earth or looked up a picture of the Santa Cruz, it meanders through this giant canyon, right? And the canyon is actually really interesting. It's this kind of stepwise canyon. And so he basically writes down that there's no way that a catastrophic flood could have formed these different layers in this way, that this was clearly like
multiple events happening over periods of time.
Multiple events, So, and of course, Sanford is not going to stand for Lyell uniformitarianism.
Of course. Which, by the way, can we quick note for creationists, learn some geology, please. Modern geologists don't adhere to like Lyell uniformitarianism. That's not the modern version. Invoking uniformitarianism from the 1800s is the equivalent of invoking Darwinism, right? It's not the modern operating theory of geology. I'm not a geologist, but as I understand it from my geology friends, thank you, you know who you are, is that the modern theory of geology is called actualism, and we don't adhere to the old version of uniformitarianism anymore. So like anytime, you can just not even worry about the specifics of what creationists are saying once they start going, well, uniformitarianism, you just be like, stop right there, flag on the play. No geologists are strictly uniformitarianism anymore. That's not how the field operates anymore. Please learn geology from the 1950s.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, the geology section is pretty short. And then he gets into the fossil record stuff. And this is effectively, there's no transitional fossils, right? He starts this off by talking about the coelacanth. I wish I could find, let me see if I can at least find the slide because it's so good.
I mean, like, one of the things that Darwin is famous for is correctly predicting the discovery of Archaeopteryx like a few years before it was found.
Just straight up, yeah.
Like, yeah, because he was saying, like, if there are...
I used that picture in class. I used that exact picture in class literally yesterday. I used that picture in class. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, he used the idea of transitional fossils and evolution to make a prediction, and they found the thing he predicted in the ground. I mean, like this whole thing just feels like Stanford should just say things Charles Darwin is wrong about. Number one, the theory of evolution. That's the whole list. Like, you know, because like it's like
no. Also, God.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's a list of two things. It's like, okay, I could have made Stanford's list just knowing the fact that he's a young Earth creationist, making a list of all the things that he thinks that Darwin's wrong about. Like, yeah, like this is an obvious list, but okay, he gave it a little bit more detail, so I assume that he's like nitpicking specific quotes.
Yeah, and then there's we've got to get a Stephen Jay Gould quote in here at some point in time. There's actually a few of them sprinkled throughout this presentation, but I had to be sure that I put up a Stephen Jay Gould quote mine in here, or it just wouldn't really be a stream about creationism otherwise.
Hey Zach, Stephen Jay Gould, famous creationist, right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Like, well-known creationist.
I love that this quote is so misused that there's like another Stephen Jay Gould quote specifically addressing creationists using this quote and debunking the creationists who try to use this. Like, I mean, get better arguments, guys.
Yeah. The fifth one was the tree of life. He claims that Darwin was wrong about the tree of life, and he puts this figure up, which I was just like found it like really baffling. So the x-axis here is supposed to be morphology, and then the y-axis is time, and then this is quote unquote actual fossil evidence. This is just lies. There's no data here, right? They just put a bunch of lines on this page.
Well, let's just be clear. This is not the first time Sanford has made a figure that's just made up, like the famous distribution of fitness effects figure in genetic entropy, literally just made up out of whole cloth. There are no numbers. It's just made up.
Even if you were to actually try to do this kind of analysis, like you would like replicate the branching tree path. Like if you were to look at like, what do the fossil records for dogs and bears look like? And you go down and down and down on this axis here, and they get more and more bear-like dogs and more bear-like or dog-like bears. And it's like the morphologies would be converging all to the carnivoran. Like,
well, that's the thing. Have you all ever seen the Jeanson figure on this? It's so funny. I think it's from Replacing Darwin, but it might be in one of his Answers in Genesis blog posts pretending to be a paper. It's where he talks about, I think it's for carnivores specifically, and it's like, so he's got dogs and cats and bears and this and that, and then it's like he illustrates like each kind, right, is a family. So you've got Canidae and Felidae and Ursidae and all the rest, and then each kind has a common ancestor. Then he has it like inside the circle, so there's like all the modern stuff around the outside, but then inside he has this hypothetical common ancestor for each kind, and they're all like cat weasel things that all kind of look the same, and you're like,
he's
Nate,
so close.
just great thinking. Now look at all those pictures that you put in the next level of the circle. Do the next level. Just follow that logic, buddy. Just keep going, right?
He's basically like, at the end of this, he just writes, I think, and then sketches out Darwin's tree like independently. Like,
Yeah. There was a really cool paper that was like looking at, it was one of those statistical supports for common ancestry papers. And they did what I thought was a really cool analysis where they basically said, okay, if fossils actually are not connected to any phylogeny, if they're not real then only the tips of phylogenies are real, and then only the fossil phenotypes are real. But the nodes that you reconstruct in a phylogeny, so the way you construct a phylogeny is you're actually inferring ancestral states, right? Statistically. So a fossil, if there is no true nodes and there's only extant taxa, then it should not be any more derived. It shouldn't have any more derived characters than any extant taxa does, right? They should be exactly the same in comparison to nodes in the tree. However, what this analysis found was that actually the fossils were always closer to the reconstructed nodes in the tree. They had much fewer derived characters than any extant taxa. And what that shows is that those fossils are absolutely connected to this tree because they don't have the same number of derived states as all the extant taxa does. And so that's why you don't, like, obviously we don't like walk back through generations, right? So like, it's not like we would ever be able to look into the fossil and see Darwin's speculation on this. Like, that's not the way organisms are laid out, you know? But we can reconstruct their relationships. And when we do that, we actually can get exactly this pattern from ancestral state reconstructions that show us that these fossils are connected to this tree.
That paper, that approach to statistically evaluating the common ancestry versus separate ancestry hypotheses based just on fossil evidence is really cool, because obviously it's very easy to do that. I mean, I say easy. Conceptually, it's very easy to do that with genomic evidence, right? With molecular data, with sequences, where it's very easy to say, like, is this nucleotide the same or not, right? And you can kind of work backwards in time to coalescence and infer what that ancestor would have looked like. Doing that with fossils is more challenging, but using the ancestral versus derived dichotomy for a given morphological feature in the record is a very cool approach. And I really appreciate that study because, importantly, not only did that study find that the combination of features you find in terms of the frequency of ancestral versus derived features supports the actual reconstruction of the phylogenetic tree, it corroborates the pattern that we find genomically. It's not that it found some other arbitrary pattern of ancestry. It all tells the same story with different, theoretically, according to creationists, right? Because they're all separate groups, independent data sets. So that study was really cool.
Dan,
yeah,
you know
I linked the paper in the chat for those that want to check it out.
You know why that is, though, right, Dan?
If you say common design, we're not friends anymore.
No. It's because they both make the same uniformitarian assumptions.
We can still be friends. We can still be friends.
This was another.
We can still be friends.
This is another thing that Sanford brings up, that, you know, about whether or not there's really a tree. And he says the whole tree is really just a mess. There's no tree. It's a tangled web. And while this is true at the broadest possible scale, so when we're looking at domains effectively, right? So if you've got prokaryotes or early eukaryotes and archaea, there's a mess because of horizontal gene transfer.
Right.
They just like accidentally bump into each other and exchange genetic material. They don't care what species it is.
They get freaky. They're whatever.
Yeah.
Get freaky.
And so because of that, the base of the tree is a web. And like we can trace all of the different lineages back to this like really confusing web. But once you get beyond, like basically once you get to like unicellular eukaryotes, it becomes extremely tree-like. There is some hybridization that occurs, so there's a little bit of webbing within closely related species, but especially once you get to like animals, like multicellular plants and animals, it's a tree. In exactly the way that Darwin thought of that a tree would look like. So I think this is really misleading on Sanford's part, because yes, the base of the tree is not a tree, but like that doesn't matter for him, right? If the primate phylogeny is a tree, that still destroys creationism.
That's right? it. Yeah, you don't need to go back 2 billion years to, and specifically Sanford is a young Earth creationist. You don't need to go back 2 billion years-ish to the origin of eukaryotes to show that Sanford is wrong. If you can go back more than 10,000 years, that's the ball game, folks. That's the end.
Yeah.
I also just love, can we just appreciate that I think. It's just a cartoon. It's just I think, as though Darwin had no data at all, as though he was, like you said, an armchair philosopher.
Yeah.
And like, this is a dude who spent 5 years circumnavigating the globe on, not a very large boat, right? Yeah. Like, to say that this is a guy who just thinking, is it like, I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah. So the sixth one is just him saying that Darwin was wrong about the nature of life. He basically argues that life is way more complex than Darwin could have ever imagined, and Darwin thought that life was simple, but we now know that life is really complex. That's nonsensical. Darwin didn't think that life was simple. No biologist has ever thought that life was simple. I don't know why people say that.
Good point.
He devoted his life to the study of something that he thought was just like simple. Like, yeah. I mean, he literally he's a biologist. Like, his entire life is studying the complexity of the biosphere.
Yeah. And like, sure, he didn't know about the molecular complexity. He didn't know about genomic complexity. Like, he didn't know about those things, but he knew it. Like, organisms are still complex. Their interactions are complex. Ecology is complex. Like, macroscopic things are complex too. And he was like fully aware of that. So like, that whole section was super weird. The last thing that I do want to touch on here is that apparently Darwin was wrong about natural selection. And this is where Sanford actually like gets into a little bit of Randy Galuza stuff here. Like, this is like a little bit of like continuous environmental tracking going on here, which was like really weird to me. So he basically argues that what is, and he gives the example of Darwin's finches, and he says that the ability for the finches to respond is pre-programmed. They've been given this pre-programmed ability that when the weather changes, they can just grow bigger beaks, right? And that's not adaptation, that's design diversity.
Is he kind of like saying some sort of like phenotypic plasticity type of idea? Like,
it's super unclear. He does not like really, just like continuous
he's
environmental
unclear?
tracking. Like,
You're telling me that
really
Sanford? You're telling me that Sanford is unclear about the mechanism underlying his model? This is my shocked face. That Sanford's unclear about how his model actually works. Yeah,
like if people think that I'm being unfair, please like go and watch this video, watch this part. I promise you, if you can make sense of it, or if you think he's putting forward a clear model, you can roast us in the comments. Like, I'm telling you, it's I could not make sense of it. It seemed like he was just saying that like the medium ground finch can just turn into a large ground finch when the weather changes, and that's not what happens. Like, that's not what differentiates these organisms. It was really, really strange. So I was like, okay, maybe he's making an epigenetics argument. I don't know. But I went through and I looked up a bunch of studies on this. And these are genetic changes. These are all allelic changes. They have mapped every single, like, you can actually find the exact SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, that are contributing to developmental pathways that are altering the beaks. And they actually have done experimental evolution where they have changed the loci in a developing chick embryo and gotten it to grow a bigger beak, right? And like that is like lead pipe evidence that this is like neo-Darwinism in the classic sense. And this is a mutation followed by selection favoring that mutation.
Why would you pick this example to make that argument? Because I'm sure you could go out into the world and find an example of an organism that has an adaptation that meets two conditions. One, we observed in, not like we watched it happen, but it's within documented human history that adaptation appeared in the population in question. And two, we don't fully understand the genetic basis for that adaptation, right? You could go out in the world and find examples of that. To use the finch beak example to try to make this point that it's not just mutation and variation and selection is bananas, because this is one of the most well-studied examples of this thing happening in natural populations. Why would you do that? It almost sounds to me like John Sanford, he's not much of a scientist. He's more of like an armchair philosopher, just reading about this stuff and thinking and just kind of,
What I love about this slide specifically is the text requires minimal new genetic information. That new genetic information there kind of seems interesting to me because it's like, okay, so you are seemingly acknowledging that there is new genetic information being introduced to like one of these two variants, and then there's an adaptation to the environment because the environment is selecting amongst those varieties from the new genetic information that was introduced. It's like, so again, what part was Darwin wrong about? Like, it's like,
Right.
Yeah. So he does this in his genetic entropy book as well. And I'm putting this slide up because it kind of does the thing that he's doing here is if it's a mutation, then it's harmful and it's natural. If there's any sort of change that seems to be helpful, well, God did that.
That was designed. That was a
That
mutation.
was designed.
That's
right?
how you know.
God put
That's
that
how you
diversion
know.
there. And so, like, he will never call anything helpful to an organism a mutation because then he would have to admit that beneficial mutations exist and that, like, adaptation can occur naturally.
Now, this actually, this makes me think of a really interesting question, which is like, okay, so if you believe that everything that's a beneficial mutation would be designed by God, then like, why do we see like that there can't be beneficial mutations that just have massive changes for the organism that would like, no way a natural mutation would be able to do that? Because if you're just attributing God to being the endower of all of these, then there should be no limits on what kinds of beneficial mutations we observe.
This is actually a really good point. The effect size of the mutation, if it's beneficial, should not matter. Like large effect beneficial mutations should exist, and yet they very rarely do. Most beneficial mutations are slightly beneficial. And we know why this is, right? Because we know that beneficial mutations occur by natural processes, and it's easier to mess up a complex system than make it better. And so it has to do it by slight gradual improvements. You don't just like immediately transform a thing and get something beneficial out of it, right? But if God was doing it, then yeah, you should be able to do that. That diversity should exist. And no, we don't see anything.
I just want to say, Zach, you are going to get quote mined on that. Congratulations. That large effect beneficial mutations are rare. Whatever you just said, guarantee you at some point, some creationist is going to stumble upon that. It'll be SFT or Sal Cordova or something. And yeah.
Well, then, Dan, you just provided the perfect rebuttal for that because you'd be like, oh, let the video play a little bit longer.
Yeah, just play it another 12 seconds. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So I wanted to end on this last slide because this was actually Sanford's last slide. And
Pascal, man. If anybody had Pascal on their bingo card, there you go. Congratulations.
And it's pretty cringe. Like the things that he reads all of this and he's like, he lost his family and his soul and countless other souls. That's my Sanford impression. And basically that's what he says. That's how he ends this. And he's like, and that was a sad way to end this, but that's the truth. And that was like, basically that's the whole presentation.
Honestly, if he's going to do that, he might as well just have had like on the slide, like Charles Darwin in hell. Might as well just go full out with it.
Well, that's like he turned his back. Look at the slide. He turned his back on the light. He's living in shadow.
He did. Yeah.
I lost it when I like saw like, but at what cost?
But at what cost?
Nothing.
Like I mean, he had a great, fulfilling career. I mean, like, what do you mean? Like he lost his family? Like I don't know what he means by some of these. And then the countless souls lost. It's like, oh,
yeah.
I mean, he
John
really
Sanford really genuinely hates Charles Darwin.
Yeah.
And again, it's because of the theological and the spiritual stuff, not the science stuff. The science stuff is window dressing. It's the soul's lost. That's the sticking point here.
Well, you know what? I might as well just say that it's actually not Darwin's fault. It's the fault of the printing press, because without the printing press, he couldn't have disseminated his ideas. So it's whoever.
And then Hitler never would have known. Without the printing press, Hitler never would have known.
Exactly. So it all goes back to Gutenberg.
The Holocaust is Gutenberg's fault. Yeah, that's.
Well, according to Sanford's logic, I mean, we would have to conclude that.
It's writing. It's the Phoenicians, those damn Phoenicians with the alphabet. It's all their fault.
Yeah. I will say that like Rob Carter also has had some talks like this that I almost picked for us to watch that are also pretty like negative Darwin.
Mhm.
That they share a lot of the same material, Carter and Sanford. So
Yes.
if you found this video from Sanford entertaining and you want a Rob Carter version of it, he's given this talk a lot of he's given this talk as well.
They've
With
co-authored a
lot of the
bunch
same
of
stuff.
stuff together, both
They have, yeah.
like actual real papers. Famously, the 2012 H1N1 paper, which is one of my favorites. Sanford and Carter wrote together. They also have written, for I think CMI together. They've co-authored papers, at least one also with our friend Paul Price. That's a trip when the three of them get together and write something. Yeah, they're all in there together. It's all one big thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're at an hour and 15, and we jumped through the last bit of this presentation, but we touched on all the big points. If you think we misrepresented him, please, you can watch the whole video.
Zach, there's one more point about Darwin that we have not touched on.
Okay.
That I've heard is a serious thing that creationists have brought up 100% unironically about why Darwin was bad and wrong. And it's that he beat puppies. And I'm being 100% serious about this.
Okay. So this is a story from the autobiography.
Uh-huh.
He beat a puppy when he was a child. He was like 8 years old. And he said that when he was the story is like he was talking about some things that he regretted doing, that he has distinct memories of. And he said one of the things one of the reasons that he realized he loved animals was that when he was very young, he beat a puppy, and he felt so bad about it that he never forgot the place that it happened at. And he says that he did like, I don't think that this is like his Victorian way of saying, I don't think the beating must have been very severe because the dog did not whine. And like, he went on to say that like, ever since then I have felt terrible because all dogs have always loved me. And like, so yes, he did tell, that was a story. He did beat a poor dog when he was 8 years old.
And that makes him wrong about everything else ever for the rest of his life.
And so natural selection is fake. The tree of life is fake.
That's like saying like, Albert Einstein, you mean that bedwetter? Because he like wet the bed when he was 8. Like it's like, okay, like that's literally, I mean, this is the level of
I'm telling you, real argument, you can, real thing.
Well,
I think I've seen like Jerry Bergman use this one before, and maybe even Kent Hovind has used this. I've seen a couple of them,
and Sal Cordova has used that one.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Kent has a lot to say about Charlie Darwin or whatever he calls it.
Hey, you know what? Hey, look, glass houses, man. Kent, maybe you should just keep your mouth shut. All right.
Yes.
Yeah, because hey, you know who Darwin didn't beat? Never mind.
Oh.
Yeah. So I will leave with one other Darwin fun fact that you probably both already know, but just since it is Darwin Day, happy birthday to Charles Darwin. There's somebody else who was born on the exact same day that Darwin was that I just want to wish a little happy birthday to Abraham Lincoln. Exact same day.
Exact same day in history. That's some serious birthday buddies right there. Charles Darwin and Abe Lincoln.
And they were both abolitionists. So
there you go.
True. Yeah.
That is true. Well, Lincoln had to come around. It took a little convincing, but yes, ultimately.
Yeah. In Darwin's, like we did talk about how Darwin was a misogynist and a racist, but in Darwin's defense, he was a pretty staunch abolitionist, even in a time when it wasn't quite cool yet.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of sort of heated discussions with Captain Fitzroy on the Beagle over dinner about abolitionism. Including one that I remember that Fitzroy told him that slaves were quite happy in their condition, and he said that, I asked a slave if he was happy in his condition, and he told me, yes, I'm very happy. And Darwin said, well, did you ask him in front of his master? So it's like, like he says what he has to say, right?
Right.
So they had lots of, they had lots of fights over this. So, as Darwin obviously had lots of poor thoughts, but the abolitionism was something that
in a era adjusted terms, he was reasonably ahead of the curve, which may we all be reasonably ahead of our curves.
Okay, well, thanks everyone so much for being here. We've consistently had like upwards of 50 viewers consistently watching this. I'm flabbergasted. Thank you all
And
so
all
much.
of you better subscribe.
Yeah, hit like and subscribe. I've got the links to the channels of both Dan and Grayson in the chat or in the details. I didn't put the Sanford video, but I'll put the Sanford video in there as well for folks to watch if you want to. So before we go, Dan, what's coming up on your channel? And Grayson, tell us what's coming up on your channel.
I got a bunch of fun stuff coming up. I've been planning. I've actually have a schedule. So so the next thing, as long as I have time to record, which in my real job, everything is on fire. So we'll see if I have time to record. But my plan, as long as I have time to record between now and next Wednesday, I've got a video in the ongoing mitochondrial mutation and substitution rate saga with Dr. Rob Carter. I've got it all scripted out. I've got the PowerPoint. I've got the visuals. It's ready. I just got to sit down and do it. So I will have an installment in that saga coming up next Wednesday. And then the following Wednesday, I'm going to re-air my debate from last month with Dr. Jerry Bergman on common descent versus common design. And then I've been truly blessed. And Zach, you've gotten a little bit of this blessing too recently, because our mutual friend Donnie Deals has just been writing. And so there have been not one, not two, but there have been 3 follow-up technical articles from Donnie and or Jerry Bergman about stuff that I brought up in that debate. And I will be covering those over the next month or however many weeks it takes. I'm going to go, one at a time. And I don't anticipate those videos to be very long because the technical articles are not very long and lack all of the features of an actual scientific paper. So they're not even trying anymore. I'll also have a few things coming up, like I'm going to do, I think the next creation myth I'll have coming out is going to be on post-flood hyperspeciation and how that's not going to work. So I've got a bunch of stuff in the hopper. Some of it is recorded and not edited. Some of it is ready to be recorded. That's what I've got coming up. I've got a bunch of stuff that should get me most of the way through March. And I'm excited about a lot of it. So everyone stay tuned. It's going to be fun.
Nice. And on my channel, actually, I was working earlier on scripting this video today. I actually had one of my subscribers said that they would sometimes show some of my videos to their son, and was saying that their son was recently really interested in human evolution from like fish to humans, and was asking if I could make a video summarizing. And I'm like, let's just go from bacteria. Like, let's go single cells to human. Let's like trace through the whole arc. That's one of my favorite parts of Carl Sagan's Cosmos. And like, I used to watch that on repeat as a kid. I love seeing all of the forms of like specifically like human evolution, and so I'm really excited to be working on that video. That's kind of been a passion project I've been working on since I got that email. But I also like a few more debates. Uploading a debate I recently had on Christianity versus atheism, which has the evidence. A debate coming up on some guy says that I got the entire foundations of science wrong. He didn't tell me why, but I'm very curious about what I got so wrong about the whole foundations of science. And then, my biggest goal for my channel in the next month or two is to, like, I've been talking about it for a while, but it's been a logistical nightmare to pull off. I want to start my new stream series, Trash Talk, where it's a call-in show. People can call in to argue or to share cool facts or just to talk. And the goal is to keep me and the stream entertained while I pick up trash outside. So I'm going to be picking up trash. People are going to be calling in. It's going to be a fun stream. Come hang out. It's going to be called Trash Talk. And I'm really, really excited to be starting that. So the main hurdle has been logistics, figuring out how to do a stream outdoors when you don't have very good internet. And I really, really did not want to get Starlink and give Elon any money. So just trying to find out the logistics for how to do that without giving Elon Musk money has been a nightmare.
Yeah, I remember when you brought this up a while ago. You mentioned it on like a stream or something a while back, and I was like, "That's a crazy idea. I love it." But if you can manage to pull it off, I will tune in.
Yeah, it's gonna be really cool.
I think at the end of this month, I'm going to it's kind of a big purchase, but I've been putting it off. But there's these drones that you can get that will follow you, like with AI, and you can walk around, and the drone will follow you around, and it can live stream. And I'm like, if I could get that to work, that would be the coolest thing ever.
See, here I was picturing one of those like harmonica attachments, but it's a phone with the camera running.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I have one of those as well. So I've got the POV shot with the phone, and then whenever the drone runs out of batteries, switches to the POV. Or I want to figure out how I can switch out. But anyways, logistics, like I said, are nightmarish.
Yeah,
I can imagine.
Yeah. So for me, I'm sure some folks might have seen the most recent video I put out. Things are pretty stressful around academia right now. So I have some things. I have some scripts that I'm working on. One of the big ones that I've been wanting to do for a while is actually a history of the Soulwright R.A. Fisher controversy. It's one of the biggest controversies in evolutionary biology, between like selection and genetic drift and a bunch of other things. There's a really fun sort of history behind it. And I think it sort of like lays the groundwork for what would eventually be the neutral theory and everything else. It's like the early big controversy. So I really wanted to do a history on that, and I've written a script on it. So hopefully I'll get around to that at some point. The next video that I want to get out is actually reverting or going back to my Causes of Evolution series. I have a gene flow video that I have been working on, or a gene flow presentation that I'm going to give. So that's the next Cause of Evolution. So that's probably going to be the next thing that I do. Hopefully not too long from now. But yeah, things are very stressful at work right now. The world is on fire, and thinking about YouTube videos is not always on the top of my to-do list. Yeah, so with that, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks all the viewers. Thanks to the panel. This has been so much fun. Happy birthday, Darwin.
Happy Darwin Day.
Yeah, I hope you've all enjoyed your Darwin Day. I hope you've learned something about Darwin. Have some answers to some of the common creationist lies about him. Thank you all so much for being here, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks, everybody.